with some luck, you might be able to see a beautiful graphic, which tells what I want to talk about. This talk is the same title as the book, which you kindly mentioned, and the story of the book is the story I want to tell you, and also just to summarize a little bit about the question I'm trying to address. I thought you might also enjoy a picture of my local cathedral. This is York Minster in the sunshine. Those of you who do come to the north of England will certainly come to this glorious medieval pre-Reformation cathedral. Let me just make that point. Okay, so we're all part of the same branch, the same tree. Our Paul would say, I'm sure we're different parts of the same body. Let's not argue whether Catholics or Protestants are ears or feet, but we just know that we're all part of the body of Christ. Let's start with that. Good. And in particular, we all want to serve God through science. So I thought I'll just summarize what I want to say, and I do apologize. Yes, there is, I'll try to minimize the number of times I show you the book, but I know Gregor has already waved it at some of us before the talk began. But I want to first of all summarize what I'm going to say. Of course, if you are interested in the book, it's clearly available in Poland. It's very cheap. It's a paperback, and you can read more. So the first thing I want to do is to say that science itself is in need of, I'll put it this way, a positive cultural narrative. Science needs a better public story. And science is in need of the church, I believe. I want to show you why that's true as much as the church is in need of science. The second summary point, or driving point, I want to say, is that we need to rethink the usual questions that we have in mind, or at least in the Protestant West. I'm sure you're more advanced than we are, of this science and religion thing. And you see, people, when I became a professional scientist, and people made no pretense about the fact I was also a committed practicing Christian, I was always being asked, well, how do you reconcile your science with your religious faith? And of course, for years, I thought that was a question, a real question that needed a real answer. And of course, I realized after a while, it's not a real question because it assumes something that's not true. And I was worrying about this question, this science-religion question. For years, I thought perhaps it was the religion that was the problem, that it was too old and not properly able to think about science. And then, of course, I discovered that wasn't true. I learned some more history, and we'll look at some of it around how particularly Christian theology has supported and developed science. So that can't be true. And then I thought perhaps the science was the problem, at least in the hands of some of its public speakers. People like Richard Dawkins in our own country have a lot of media time, who are convinced that science renders religious belief impossible for all but the clinically insane. It says so. But of course, then I discovered that it's a tiny minority of scientists who believe that. And then I realized, no, the problem is not with the word religion or the word science. The problem is with this word, and. And this is just a little word. And of course, as soon as you say science and religion, it's like saying north and south, east and west, Arsenal and Manchester United, if you play soccer. It creates an opposition, and that's not the right category. The right category is to think more of a theology of science, a purpose for science. The other thing is, I want to say that science, one of the problems here is that science is often articulated as something very new, something very modern, or even late modern. What I want to say that although it wasn't called science many centuries ago, that the human activity we now call science has very much more ancient roots, has a very deeply human story that is embedded in our deepest and longest, in fact, our biblical stories. talking of biblical stories, I want to rethink our approach to the Bible for these questions, in particular wisdom literature. I also noticed that when I got to think seriously about this question of theology and science, how little Bible material there is on it. There's not much biblical studies behind it, and always a suspect of that. And what there was seemed to be very tightly associated with tense discussions about how to interpret the first chapter of Genesis. It's not very helpful. But instead I decided that it dawned on me that the right place to start is the wisdom literature, and in particular Job. So I'm going to advocate that we read, as scientists, the book of Job prior to we start thinking about the book of Genesis. I think that also I noticed that different aspects of science, particular subjects within science, were preferred in science-religion debates. I mean, many of them you've introduced yourselves and you work in those areas. So astronomy, plenty of particle physics, but actually not much sort of material science or statistical mechanics or the science of fluctuations and chaos. And I think that's going to be important too. We'll see why in just a little bit. And as I mentioned before, it's part of this rethinking this and in science and religion. We need to move from a theology and science discussion to a theology of science discussion. And what I mean by that is, rather than ask, how do we reconcile our science and our Catholic or Christian faith? That's not the question. The question is what is this gift of science for? Let's be honest as Christians, as members of Christ's body. We're in the church. We're called by God and gifted by God to play our role in this long story of creation and fall and redemption and calling and incarnation and building and choosing the church and blessing the church with the Holy Spirit and eventual second creation. So within that story, why has God given us the gift of doing science? For what purpose? Or what teleology is the posh academic word. That's what I mean by a theology of science, and that's the real question. And I've come to believe that if we can achieve a significant answer to that question, then the answer of reconciling science and Christian faith looks after itself. Okay, now. So that's what I want to do. So now, if you prefer just to go on Facebook and do social media until question time, you can do that. I'm now going to fill in some details on all that until it's question time. But I want to have clues. I want to harvest some clues from other voices. My first clues are going to come from our colleagues in the geography departments or social science departments or science studies. I don't know if your universities have a science technology studies unit. And Durham University does. I spent some years there. And I was interested in the narrative analysis. What are the metaphors? What are the pictures? What are the words that people use, or the ideas, when discussing difficult problems of science? COVID is one, and we've had a recent study in our church project on this one. But here's a project done a few years ago on nanotechnology. You might remember the promise of nanotechnology to revolutionize our lives, but it received a rather tense public and political reception. Prince Charles in our own country said that nanotechnology would destroy us all by grey robotic goo. I think that was probably not one of the most wise things Prince Charles has ever said. But anyway, what this project discovered was there are 5 underlying stories behind public opposition to this new science. I could have chosen genetically modified food. But here they are. It's be careful what you wish for. You don't invent this because it has unanticipated consequences. Or secondly, don't invent a new thing, because Pandora's the ancient Greek myth of Pandora's Zeus's daughter who let the troubles out into the world. Yeah, be careful what you wish for. The third, don't mess with nature. Nature is sacred and shouldn't be disturbed by human beings. Science will keep all of us in the dark. Or finally, it'll just make the rich richer and the poor poorer. So there are three ancient stories and two modern ones. The philosopher Jean-Pierre Dupuy calls them the narratives of despair. The first one he calls narrative desire. Be careful what you desire. Opening Pandora's box, the story of evil. Science is connected with that. Science connected with trampling on the sacred, and the modern narratives of alienation and exploitation. And these were underlying, as I said, many of public debates about science. We've done a recent project around the coronavirus pandemic, and the same stories surface, or even get just under the surface there. Note two things. All of these 5 metaphors or stories, narratives for science, are negative, and also they are all godless. There's no religious in general or Christian voice here at all. And I suggest that might be because the church hasn't really understood properly and engaged with science as God's gift. On we might go. Here's a second clue of what might be going on. It came from me from Unusual Presence, this lovely book, a book by George Steiner, recently died actually, late 20th century, wonderful Jewish scholar of letters with chairs in Europe and the US. As a former Jewish atheist, it is extraordinary that in this book, Steiner chooses the Christian Easter metaphor to describe the human condition. He has no other language for it. He says we all know the Friday of despair and pain, and we all know the Sunday of future hope, but we all live on the Saturday. It's quite wonderful, isn't it? He does this. At one point, he talks about art and the purpose of art. And I'll never forget when I first read this, only art, he says, can go some way towards making accessible, waking into some measure of communicability, the sheer inhuman otherness of matter. It struck me between the eyes, this statement, because it opened up what other people have said. Hannah Arendt said this, Heidegger said this. In some ways, Christian theologians have said this, of course, for centuries, that there's a gap. It's a consequence of the fall in our worldview. There's a gap between humanity, people, and the world. And that gap is like a wound and it needs healing. And people are underneath aware of this, of the inhuman otherness of matter. We don't feel happy in our world and we don't quite know what's wrong. And Steiner suggests art, only art, in fact, can make communicable the inhuman otherness of matter. But of course, you can imagine what I, as a young physicist, trying to work out what my science might be for within God's purposes for me. I read this and wanted to say, Mr. Steiner, yes, science too. What else does science do but to make accessible, to start communicating with the inhuman otherness of matter? That's what we do. But so this is a profoundly theological statement and is another clue to what might be going on. Real Presences, I recommend it. There are other clues as to this brokenness. The theology and science pain is part of a wider pain. Most of this is for another day, but there is, of course, in our universities a deep division, another wound between the humanities and the sciences. And this goes back a long way, long before even the 19th century Romantic poets. I don't know if in Poland, John Keats or Wordsworth or Edgar Allan Poe are read, but Keats, who was medically trained, but famously wrote in his long poem, Lamia, these lines here: philosophy, he means science here, natural philosophy, will clip an angel's wings, conquer all mysteries by rule and line, empty the haunted air and gnomed mine, unweave a rainbow, which is why Dawkins called his book Unweaving the Rainbow, or Reweaving the Rainbow. And you see what these poets were saying was that science disenchants the world. Science removes glory, wonder, awe from the world. And again, this made me wonder if part of our problem of theology of science is not tainted by this, I think, misunderstanding of what science does. I thought I'd show you just one slide of something I've been thinking about for a few years. And it touches on the science of chaos. I realized that if there's a leitmotif, a sort of theme that connects, it wasn't a deliberate theme, but it connects a lot of my research. It's the theme of how order comes out of chaos in the world, or even how delicate structures, particularly I'm working now on the physics of biology, persist in an environment of thermal, random, chaotic motion. Here's a picture of a protein that we studied at Durham, actually bound to DNA. And of course, biology texts and books are full of these structural diagrams. But if you allow your mind to imagine what this looks like at the molecular scale, at room temperature, or do a computer simulation at room temperature, you will find these structures are very compromised. Even the DNA, not shown here, is twisting and coiling and uncoiling. The protein is opening up and closing, and its structure is very fuzzy. But this is a particular example of a protein that needs to convey an information signal across it when it is bound or unbound to DNA. And how can this still, quiet voice be heard in this noisy environment? Some clues have come to me from history. Again, I was told, I know you have better education in history in Poland, but I was told that the medieval world suppressed science, in fact, suppressed all new learning. But as Leszek introduced me, I now work in some of the week in the Centre for Medieval Studies, and I've been fascinated by unraveling some of the science of the 13th century in a lovely interdisciplinary project I'll tell you about another time in more detail, where scientists and medieval scholars and historians come together. This is Robert Grosseteste, or a picture of Robert Grosseteste. Again, this is all before the Reformation, so we're all one church here, who became Bishop of Lincoln. But before then, in Oxford, he wrote books about comets, light, the stars, motion, sound. And he applies his theory, his extraordinary theory of light-filled matter, to the problem of cosmogony. How, he says, do things have volume, finite volume? And how does the universe have finite volume? And in 1225, in his De Luce, he posits that when God created light, that light was created in a point, which then expanded into a giant sphere, structuring the entire cosmos. Of course, we need our humanities colleagues to decipher and interpret difficult to read Latin manuscripts like this. But when we do that, they, turns out, need some scientists to help them understand the very mathematical content, not algebraic, because they didn't have algebra, but mathematical content of the sort of physical laws that are being imagined. This is completely new science in the early 13th centuries. So precisely is it articulated that we were able to write down mathematical translations of Grosseteste's Big Bang medieval model of the cosmos, solve it, and what happens is that the initial expansion stops when matter reaches its lowest possible density, because Aristotle said you can't have a vacuum, and in comes this shining new inward light which structures the celestial spheres. Now, this is, of course, a geocentric universe, not a heliocentric one. It's nothing to do with the cosmology that some of you cosmologists, astronomers know far better than I. But he's asking and approaching the questions in the same way that we do. He's asking, are there signs in the sky now that can give us clues as to the dynamics and kinetics of the early moments of the cosmos? That hasn't changed since then. And in collaboration with the Centre for Cosmological Computing at Durham, we were able to solve the Gross test equations, and we've actually got new science from old. And here's the solar system. You can create all different numbers of planets. But anyway, I want to just show you this to indicate that the tendency to do science, the desire to do it, and to model in our minds in an explicitly Christian framework has been around for a long time. And of course, this is the universe that he's after. I should just say that what Grostis is doing here is a deeply theologically driven science. He's meeting Aristotle head on. It's Aristotle, which of course the medieval Christians were largely appropriate. They were largely teaching Aristotle. They liked Aristotle. But when Aristotle says there's no beginning, no temporal beginning to the universe, Grostis says he's wrong about this. So of course he's wrong. He doesn't know. He's not a Christian. He doesn't have the Bible. But Grostis doesn't say we therefore take the Bible as science. He says, no, we take the Bible as a clue and a motivation to do science. And what Grostis does is using Aristotle physics against Aristotle to show that the Christian notion of a beginning of the universe can be explained by Aristotle's own pagan physics if he did but know the truth. So very interesting. Going back a bit, earlier than Gross test, I find some of the most wonderful scientific writing in the early church fathers, in the patristics, or in this case, the early church mother. Probably some of you may know that Basil the Great, and Gregory of Nyssa, two brothers who were involved, of course, in the early creedal philosophical and discussions of formulation of the Trinity, had a wonderful older sister, Macrina, who they called the teacher. She was an extraordinary woman, obviously very educated, and they would never dare run a theological treatise in public without running it past Macrina. There she is in iconic form. There's Gregory. And this is a short passage. I won't read all of it, but it's from a wonderful book called On the Soul and the Resurrection, which is a very moving account of a discussion between Macrina and Gregory when Macrina is dying. And it's so typically gendered that you can believe this, because here's the man, and in fact, great church father, is completely lost in grief about the death of his sister. And she, while she is dying, in considerable pain, I'm sure, is nonetheless healing his grief. As well as suffering her own pain, very much the older sister. And she says, well, let's do this by having a debate like the old times. Let's debate the reality of mind, or psyche. It's often translated as soul, but I think it should be translated mind here. I'll take the view that there is really mind, and you take the view that mind is just an epiphenomenon of matter. We pride ourselves, don't we, in our artificial intelligence age, to be wise to a new debate about whether mind is just a consequence of biology or of circuitry. No. This is a very old discussion. It can be found in a 4th century document. And they argue to and fro, and then Macrina offers her coup de grace, her final argument, which is, look, he says, take a bottle, take a jar, it's which you call empty, and you'll show yourself it's not really empty by pushing it under some water, because it's got air in it, and you can tell there's air in it because the water is there's a spectacle, a sort of combat going on in the neck between the two elements. The water can't just rush in which it would do if it were empty. It has to fight something which bubbles out. And so, although you can't see the air with your eyes, you can see the air with your mind, because you deduce what lies beneath the structure of the world, this strong current of air gurgling bubble against it. It's beautiful. And she says, when you look at the moon, if you didn't have a mind independently able to think and create, you would just think the moon was a disk that grew to a sliver and then became a half and then grew into but because you have a mind, it's a sphere illuminated by the sun. In other words, This is doing science. Science is, if anything else, science is surely using our scientific imagination of mind to reconstruct and see underneath the surface of the perceived universe what there is underneath. Another narrative cue is the name of our own discipline. Leszek mentioned that York University has been very kind and for the first time in 200 years has called my own chair that I have at its university the Chair of Natural Philosophy. For 200 years, scientists have been called scientists, not natural philosophers. And I think that's part of the problem as well, because language is important too. And even if we don't know Greek and Latin, in our countries whose languages draw on those languages, we feel what's going on. Science. It's a hard word, a sibilant word, and it comes from, of course, sciere, scio, I know. It's a knowledge claim to be a scientist. But to be the older form of scientist is to be a natural philosopher, philosophia. I love wisdom, goes to Greek. So I've sometimes said to people who don't find science easy, I said, well, suppose we didn't call it science. Suppose we call it the love of wisdom to do with natural things. Ah, they say, that sounds something I could get interested in. And so we make do from there. So, and that's also a clue as to the tributary from which science comes. Actually, we know there are we know of one tributary already. We've mentioned Aristotle and we've referred to the ancient Greeks, and the Hellenic ancient world is surely one stream from which science comes, but there's another stream from which science comes, which is the biblical stream, the Semitic stream, the Jewish stream of biblical wisdom. And let's find out about it now. And let's go straight to one of the lovely passages from the book of Job, which is the hymn to wisdom. I don't know how well you know the book of Job, but there are these arguments between Job, who is a righteous suffering man, and his friends who are sure that if he's suffering, he must have been a bad boy. He must have been a sinner. He knows he isn't. They have a brittle theology of nature. He knows he hasn't. And the arguments eventually by chapter 27 have got nowhere. There's an impasse. And then we hear a new voice, and it turns out to be the voice of a searcher for wisdom. But it doesn't start being clear that it's about wisdom. It starts by taking us down a mine. Surely there's a mine for silver, a place where gold is refined. Iron is taken from the soil. It talks about miners dangling on a rope. Incidentally, this passage of the Bible, not known by many people, is known by every son and daughter of Durham miners, coal miners. The University of Durham is surrounded by a coal mining region. Coal mining very important in Poland as well. So you might encourage your mining villages to refer to this as the miner's prayer. It's on the wall in Easington Parish Church, and every little girl and boy knows it as the miner's prayer. It's the place in the Bible where miners are mentioned in a very special way. And they're special because only they can see. Read the end. That earth from which food comes forth is underneath changed by fire. Its rocks are the source of lapis with flecks of gold. This is what the miners see. No one else sees the structure of the earth underneath the surface, but by their art and their sight, they can see it. It says not only that, even the hawk with her sharp eyes, or the king of priests on the surface, can see what humans see, which is the structure of the earth underneath. And at the end of the search to wisdom, you get this transparent sight into the created world once more. But this time it's not miners that are seeing underneath the earth. It's God, the creator. For he looked to the ends of the earth and beheld everything's under heavens, to assign weight to wind and determine the waters by measure. This transparent measuring details of X-ray vision is right there at the heart of the wisdom book. 10 chapters later, we get a crescendo, an even greater poem, which is called The Lord's Answer to Job. But paradoxically and well known, and here are William Blake's illustrations of the book of Job. By the way, I thought you'd like them. There are questions instead. Have you journeyed to the springs of the sea, asks Yahweh. Where is the way to the abode of light? From whose womb comes the ice? Can you bind the Pleiades and loose Orion's stars? In other words, why are the Pleiades together? And the seven sisters, we call them also, in the autumn sky. You can see them out in the clear sky tonight, whereas Orion's stars are scattered. This is a great astrophysics question, with a real answer, actually. Do you know the laws of the heavens? And can you apply to them the earth? I will never forget the first time I read this as a young Christian and a young scientist. This was my chapter. These were the questions that are the root questions of the fields of meteorology and astronomy and earth science and zoology too. They're extraordinary. And without wanting to be presentist about them, we have to understand why this book has them. Now, the Lord's Answer has received quite a bit of criticism. In the theological literature, the first criticism is it's not an answer because it's full of questions. It's a sort of slap down, it's a put down. People read as if it's saying, Job, do you know the answer to these things? You don't. I do. So why don't you just shut up, stop complaining and accusing me? But oh dear. It's not that. I don't think that's the right interpretation. For one thing, no Hebrew ever, no biblical Jew ever uses questions as a put down, as an insult. Questions are more precious than that. Go to a Seder, they're always educational. They're always asked to inform, not to make feel small. Secondly, the second criticism is the Lord's Answer is irrelevant to the book of Job, because the book of Job is about the moral problem of suffering when one is righteous. Why me? It's not about the material universe. Well, I wonder whether these theologians have ever read the first chapters of the book of Job. It's the most material book in the whole of the scriptures. There's not a verse that goes by, or a chapter that goes by without talking about earth, wind and stones, and what is more, or something cosmical. It's structured in the form of these cycles, speech cycles, where Job and his friends go round, each takes a turn, and then again and again. And the natural world, the physical material backdrop, enhances each time from inanimate nature to second cycle, plants, animals, vines, the animate nature, life. And then finally, when the arguments get vicious, it's the cosmology that's there at the back of the argument. No, this is a thoroughly cosmic book. Why is that? Well, I need to give great acknowledgement to David Klein, of the University of Sheffield. Leszek and I met in Sheffield, and the Sheffield University rejoices in having the only department of Old Testament studies in a UK university. And David Klein has made the book of Job his lifetime study and kindly let me use his fresh translation of the Hebrew. He calls Job the most intense book, theologically, intellectually, all the Old Testament. So who are we to argue with that? So I wanted to read this book of Job as a scientist, but become therefore particularly attuned, use my material tuning to respond to its natural wisdom. And this is the point. The reason that nature is invoked is because it turns out of my same driving research interest, how the world survives, how structure and beauty and life emerges in this chaotic cosmos. Job accuses his tormentors of acting like chaotic nature, and therefore implies that God isn't even in control of nature either. That look, the wadis, the treacherous wadis, the seasonal streams that overflow, and then in summer they dry up and nothing can happen. He accuses his own flesh, God, of making his own flesh dissolve back into chaos. It's horrible, his own flesh decaying like cheese. So Job is as much about the lack of law and order embedded in nature as it is about morality. Look, he says, God may build things, but then he destroys them. The waters dry things up and then they overwhelm the earth. And throughout the book, there's this clash, this paradox of order and chaos and hope and hopelessness. There are little seeds of hope all the way through. You may know a very famous verse later on, I know my Redeemer lives, is in Job, from Handel's Messiah later. But here, in one of his friends, there's sometimes little hope. For you will be, this is Eliphaz speaking of Job's future redemption, and as George Steiner might say, reconciliation with the sheer inhumanness of matter. This is the biblical word for it, because Eliphaz says, you will be, when you are reconciled over this gulf, in covenant with the stones of the field. Now, some translators have just not had the courage to translate the Hebrew berit, which is used for Abrahamic and Mosaic covenants, as covenant here. Why? Because how could you have a covenant with a stone? A covenant is for kings. A covenant is for God and people, not for stones. Or is it? Could we perhaps think of our work in this fallen world as regards nature of building a covenant with nature? And yet, of course, then the chaos takes over and the mountain slips away. Now, it's interesting to look at the different voices in Job. This is my last little mining of Job for us. And there are not 5, but 6 voices or perspectives on nature. There are his friends, that nature enshrines moral law. Knows if you are bad, it is nature that will punish you with destruction or ruin. Elihu tends to talk about nature's eternal mystery. Job talks about, or Zophar talks about reading the book of nature as a source of wisdom. Job, as we've seen, thinks nature is a place of uncontrolled chaos. And at one point, he's accused by God of worshipping nature like the pagans. But there is a 6th voice. And note that this 6th voice, which is nature and our relationship with nature, are quantitative, observed, careful, reconstructed, uniquely human understanding of nature is a way to wisdom itself and God's wisdom. A very positive, very holy narrative is the only one not represented. You met these before. Can you see? Jean-Pierre Dupuis' old, dismal pagan narratives are still there, or originally there, in the book of Job. Nature is exploitative on us, or alienative on us, or sacred that we can't tread on, or is the embodiment of evil, or the subject of unholy desire. But there's a 6th way. And remember, what we set out to do this evening is to ask the question, does the Bible give us, does our Christian inheritance give us a narrative, a positive narrative, in which we might take our, or frame our science within the kingdom of God? And I'm beginning to suggest it does, that it's a way of wisdom, but to do something. Now we have to think about what it is really that we're doing. Oh, by the way, I was once challenged by a famous atheist blogger, won't tell you who they were, but there are many of them, to give them one example of the book of Job ever inspiring science. It turns out there are many, but my favorite, for what it's worth, is also my favorite example of a simultaneous discovery. And this is the final wonderful discovery of the oldest scientific problem out there in meteorology and optics, which is the problem of the rainbow. And in almost the same year, in the early 14th century, Theodoric of Freiburg, in now southern Germany, and Kamal al-Din in Baghdad, both did the same experiment, because they've been reading Ibn al-Haytham, the great Islamic Golden Age philosopher who invented the camera obscura, and made model raindrops out of water-filled glass. Let a sunbeam through, just as Newton was to do for his prism 350 years later. It was not Newton who solved the rainbow. It was these 2 people. And here's Theodoric's diagram of the rays from the sun refracting as he saw them in his camera, in his little experiment in 1306. Reflecting off the back of raindrops and coming out. And actually, he even noticed that some of the rays reflect twice in the raindrop, and that would produce a double rainbow. And so he explained the double rainbow in the same go. In one of his personal commentaries on his natural philosophy, he says the reason he pursued these studies is because he was inspired to do so by reading in Job chapter 38, in the Lord's answer, the question, by what way is the light scattered and the heat distributed upon the earth? This difficult question the Lord proposed to holy Job. And Theodoric gives us in his diaried account, in his account De Luce et Eos Origine, on light and its origin, that he was inspired by Job. Of course, we also have the New Testament lens to look at this through. But once, and we must do this as Christian thinkers, we should do this. But we find once you're alerted to this Old Testament, this Hebrew Bible wisdom, you see it's behind everything that Paul writes, and it's in the Gospels as well. Here's Paul writing also, like Job, suffering. The Corinthian correspondence is Paul in deep brokenness. So it's a good place to compare Paul and Job. And look at what Paul starts talking about. He goes to the whole of creation. If anyone's in Christ, new creation, famous thing, the old has gone, the new has come. All this is from God, who, now listen carefully now, reconciled himself through Christ and gave us the ministry of reconciliation, that God was reconciling the world, the Greek is cosmos, to himself in Christ. And I've always been deeply impressed by this, because this is Paul's soundbite for what Christianity is, what the church does. And I think if Paul were on Radio 4, Leszek was indicating I'm sometimes on Radio 4 in the morning in the news and current affairs program, giving the little 3-minute thinky slot, religious reflection slot. If Paul were interviewed by one of those people today, now what is it, Paul? You've got 1 minute to tell me, because the news is coming up, news and sport is coming now. What are you? What is this movement? Are you zealots? Are you Christians? Are you revolutionaries? Are you Jewish? Are you a sect? What are you? And I'm sure Paul would say he wouldn't refer to Moses. He wouldn't necessarily refer straight away to Jesus of Nazareth, because the listeners wouldn't know that. He'll say, John, I know, let me tell you what we do. We're healers of broken relationships. That's what we do. We have the ministry of reconciliation. That's what it's all about. And I think that's a beautiful way of describing our calling. And it's a cross-shaped way. You know, we are enabled and empowered to heal broken relationships, because the source of all healing, which itself was broken, our relationship with God, has been mended by Christ. And that mending of that fundamental relationship allows us to heal others, including, of course, with medicine, the healing of our broken relationship to our own bodies, by politics, if your calling is that, the healing of the brokenness of nations, maybe in academia, the healing of our broken disciplines, and in theology too. Here's Jim Dunn from Durham on Romans, and another Pauline passage is about the disjointedness of the cosmos. All creation groans in pain, it's a childbearing pain, until this relationship is sorted out. So, to conclude, I'm going to propose for our discussion a framing of the answer to my question. What would a theology of science be through these many clues of science and writing throughout history, through our own experience as scientists within the Christian church, and within this reading of wisdom? I'm going to suggest that science is, as it were, the toolkit that allows us to deploy this work, this participative work. It's relational work, relating to the world, to God, to each other. It's co-creative. That's interesting. As created in the image of God. I wonder if it's not all that surprising, is if God's self, first act is to create the world, if therefore God's image is first act, also create. But of course, we don't create worlds, we create us, doesn't it? Creates a relationship as part of our fallen nature. So science becomes a really holy task. Now, just some things to note about it. It emphasizes a long relationship. Science isn't recent, it's part of a long story. It in some way explains, it certainly celebrates this high view of a human aptitude to reimagine the natural world. It takes us beyond knowledge. It says knowledge in science is not enough. knowledge needs to be partnered by wisdom. Phronesis, yes, but Sophia. It will warn us that our task, like Job's task, is at sometimes ambiguous and painful. But it's our task, and we're called to do it and not given the answers. Like Job, we will be balancing order and chaos. So I love statistical mechanics because it balances order and chaos and asks how order can come out of chaos. Look at what it celebrates, and this is something we need to do in our education, isn't it? In England particularly, I'm sure you do this better in Poland, we overemphasize the fact that science, we can get kids to believe that science is about finding the right answer. But we all know that the task of science is to conceive the creative question. And this task, of course, also celebrates the creative question. Was it Rabi's mum? There's this lovely story of Isidore Rabi, who says when he got home from school every day, his mother used to ask him not what you've learned today, but he'd ask him, Isidore, did you ask any good questions today? That's what we should encourage all our children to ask. The Book of Job has the best questions. And of course, it connects science to another word, which is not often heard in scientific circles, which is love. This is a work of love because it's our, in Imago Dei, loving the world and using this special sight that God gives us, that in which God also shares. And we do this because we love the universe. One consequence of this is that the church should be the obvious possessor of science. Now, I don't need to tell you this because it was Copernicus, wasn't it, who said that doing astronomy is a form of worship. So you've known this for centuries. We're coming late to it. But I thought I'd just tell you a little bit about the project I do with Durham, David Wilkinson. We're working with the Church of England. Uniquely, very unusually, you probably know that Church of England bishops sit in our upper house of Parliament, so they have direct contact with the laws of our land. So it's important that they know science. So we're running workshops to support in this Equipping Christian Leadership in Age of Science, ECLAS project, to help them understand. This was an example of shale gas and fracking, very well informed. And of course, what the church can bring to scientific debates. We don't need to fall down necessarily on one side or other of an argument, you know, should we stop coal mining now or later? What the church can do is to bring two values to these political debates desperately lacking in the public sphere. One is love of each other and respect and refusal to use the tactics of fear and aggression. And the second is a love of truth. Just imagine the quality of our scientific public discussion if the church successfully gifted to our political discourse love, respect, and truth. Enough said. We have some work to do. And enough said, it's time to conclude. So let me just remind you what I said, and then we can perhaps have a bit of discussion before we finish. There's these negative stories of science, and they're pagan, and they're godless, and they need new narratives, and they need it from the church. And I'm going to suggest that the whole tradition of wisdom is a sort of forgotten resource for these fresh ways of thinking about science and Christian belief or religion in general. Well, you know, did you see what happened to the old question of science and being opposed to Christian faith? It just goes away, right, when you start working at this level. And, you know, I think this might help. Some of these theological roots can be these other doors. Some people who find science hard because the one door at school of doing exams in chemistry isn't the way that helps them. Maybe we can find a wider, more healthy, shared public experience of science. If you want some further reading, there's a little bit there. And at this point, I should thank you very much for my invitation and for listening to me and for having me with you, allowing me to share these things. I'm very grateful. Thank you.